Hello, I am going to finish up chapter 30. Remember, we're going to be meeting with some of you to go over some DBQ stuff. But so this is allowing us to be in multiple places at once. So let's make sure we understand, chapter 30. One thing I want to show you two clips first. The first one is about Phyllis Schlafly, who's about the ERA movement, and she's the one who really gets the credit for stopping the ERA movement. So let's first watch this clip and make sure you're watching it.
Let the Congress listen. We are here. We are Americans, and we will not be denied.
Help pass ERA.
Help pass ERA.
After 30 states ratified the amendment within a year, feminists were certain that victory was inevitable.
There is absolutely nothing that ERA will do for women.
But the fight to ratify the ERA was about to come up against a changing political climate and one of the most canny and effective opponents feminists had ever faced.
The main trouble with the feminist movement is that it teaches women to be victims, that they are victims of the patriarchy. And I think that's ridiculous. I think American women are the most fortunate class of people who ever lived on the face of the earth.
Now, I thought what I might do is to run through the arguments that we present against the Equal Rights Amendment.
I think Phyllis Schlafly tapped into the feeling that many women had things were changing too fast, what was going to happen, were they going to be taken care of?
I want my children to look up to their daddy. I want them to know that he is the head of the house, that he can take care of me and them, that he can protect us. That's what we've got him for. That's why I married him, to be protected.
I would like to thank my husband, Fred, for letting me come today. I love to say that because it irritates the women's livers more than anything that I say.
To many feminists, Schlafly was at best a contradiction, and at worst, a hypocrite.
She didn't know she was a feminist. You know, she ran a movement. She was rarely home. She was on the road all the time, and she had the support of other women who helped raise her children and an understanding husband, and yet she railed against women wanting that for themselves.
I used to say to her, I think I've fixed more dinners at home than you have.
As the deadline for passage approached, feminists readied for the final push at an historic conference in Houston, Texas.
The conference brings delegates from all over the country to Houston, and it brings them with real drama, someone carrying a torch just like the Olympics, all the way from Seneca Falls, where the first women's conference was held, all the way to Texas.
There were three first ladies, Mrs. Carter, Mrs. Ford, and Mrs. Johnson. No generation before us since the suffragists had had a national conference of women's equality. And that's when we began to feel the power of Phyllis Schlafly's Stop ERA movement.
Not to be outdone, Schlafly staged her own rally, also in Houston, at the same time.
We fill that arena so full that the fire marshals made us stop, and they had to stand outside.
I'm opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment. I'm opposed to abortion. I'm opposed to the granting of so-called civil rights to homosexuals that would allow them to, say, teach in our schools.
The dueling rallies brought droves of reporters to Houston. Feminists wanted to take advantage of the national spotlight by presenting a broad agenda, including a plank to end discrimination based on sexual preference.
That lesbians have been in the closet too long.
But the gesture, long overdue as far as lesbians were concerned, backfired on the movement.
I watched this morning the corruption of young people in Albert Thomas Hall.
At Schlafly's convention across town, conservative Congressman Bob Dornan pounced.
And the greatest tragedy of all was to see 3 former first ladies of this nation approving of sexual perversion and the murder of young people in their mothers' wombs. What a disgrace!
We oppose the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. All in favor say aye.
Coming out of Houston, it was the anti-ERA forces that had captured the momentum.
The big turnout in Houston really said to the makers in Washington and the powers that be, this group of women in America do not want the Equal Rights Amendment.
Time ran out for the Equal Rights Amendment today. The 24-word statement pledging equality for women under the Constitution fell 3 states short of ratification.
I was brokenhearted that the Equal Rights Amendment didn't pass. I couldn't believe that it wouldn't.
The fact that it didn't pass just astounded me. In the eyes of the law, why shouldn't we be treated equally?
Though many discriminatory laws had already been struck down, the ERA's defeat meant that there was no blanket constitutional protection against such laws, now or in the future. It also meant that the pendulum of public opinion had swung back against the women's movement.
All right, so hopefully you saw that. You could see how like the ERA was really close. They failed. They were 3 states short of getting ratified in the time frame that they had, and the ERA is still not, you know, a thing today. So just remember, we're talking about that new conservative movement. This is a huge part of like end of period 8, beginning of period 9. Please note, for social issues, you have like Roe versus Wade. And you also have the ERA movement that's going to lead to that conservatism. So Phyllis Schlafly is like the female counterpart, you know, for this Ronald Reagan revolution. Okay. Also, with the rise of conservatism, you have, you know, we talked about political stuff like with Barry Goldwater and stuff like that. There's also going to be a free market, a capitalist economist that's going to be really big during this time. Milton Friedman. If you ever see Milton Friedman, he's all about capitalism, free market, you know, supply and demand naturally. And again, they're opposing this new conservative coalition. Is they oppose big government. They oppose the New Deal and the Great Society liberalism. They oppose gun control, ultra feminism, gay rights, welfare, affirmative action, abortion, drug use. Okay. A lot of them are really worried that these issues are going to undermine like family values and religious values. Okay. Let's see. We talked about the religious revival. We talked about Jerry Falwell in particular. Just note, there's a guy named Pat Robertson. You might have heard of the 700 Club, Oral Roberts, Jim Baker. It's not just the moral majority and Jerry Falwell. There's other ones too. Let's see. And what happened is that, you know, the moral majority, they were able to get a lot of members of Congress into seats that were, you know, conservative. Let's see. All right, so I have one more clip to show you that's really important. So you can see here, let me see. that there's lots of reasons for this resurgence, this new conservative movement. You have political things like Barry Goldwater and the conscience of a conservative. He wrote this publication that got a lot of support. So his publication about his ideas and stuff is called The Conscience of a Conservative. States' rights, stuff like that. Reagan gives a very famous speech called A Time for Choosing, we'll watch in a second. The economy, free market principles like Milton Friedman was talking about, okay? Deregulation, meaning like the government has too many rules and stuff, okay? So again, Milton Friedman's really big there. Okay, right to work laws are laws that support not allowing unions. Like Georgia is a right to work state. So like government employees cannot join a union. Okay. You have social and cultural reasons. William Buckley was a political commentator, just really talked about, how this backlash to liberalism and stuff. Okay. Who tends to make up this new conservative movement? People living in the suburbs and rural areas, people in the Bible Belt and like the Midwest and like Appalachian Mountains, corporations, yuppies, Protestant, Christians. And these are some interest groups that were just supporting conservatism. Okay. We'll skip.
No nation in history has ever survived a tax burden that reached a third of its national income.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to skip that. So A Time for Choosing, okay? Remember I told you how at the Republican convention, Barry Goldwater received the Republican nomination. Prior to receiving the Republican nomination, there's like an opening speech. That speech is Ronald Reagan, younger Ronald Reagan in 1964, before he's governor of California. And his speech is called A Time for Choosing, which really outlines this new conservative movement. And again, he gave this in 1964. Okay. Again, we talked about the Christian right and Roe versus Wade and homosexual rights and stuff. You have the moral majority. There's Jerry Falwell right there. Okay. You have Jim Baker, Billy Graham, Pat Robertson. They really will use the TV to get their point across. Okay. All right. I'm going to show you a clip, if it will let me. There we go. About Barry Goldwater and Reagan.
People say Goldwater lost in 1964. Some of us think Goldwater won. It just took 16 years to count the votes. In 1980, we finally got the result. People say Goldwater lost in 1964. Some of us think Goldwater won. It just took 16 years to count the votes. In 1980, we finally got the results in, and conservatism had won.
Governor, are you prepared to take the...
Goldwater started the trend toward conservatism. Reagan picked up the ball and ran with it.
If Reagan was the savior of modern conservatism, Goldwater was clearly, John the Baptist to Reagan.
Ronald Reagan, who was a former grade B movie actor, made a speech for the Goldwater campaign for president in 1964. It ran on national television, and it was an overnight success.
Barry Goldwater has faith in us. He has faith that you and I...
And it was people who were brought up in the Goldwater movement who later were responsible for nominating and electing Ronald Reagan.
Today's conservative ascendancy was built out of the ashes of Goldwater's loss.
We didn't win a lot of elections back in the 50s, early 60s. But then in the mid-70s, conservatives figured out what we were missing, and that was the social issues. Traditional values and a lot of issues dealing with family, home, community. And we began to add that element to our political rhetoric.
And the perverts, and the liberals, and the leftists, and the communists coming out of the closets, it's time for guns people to come out of the closet, out of the churches, and change America. We must do it.
Some of the conservatives from the 50s and the 60s were uncomfortable with bringing the social issues into the arena. And Goldwater was one of those people.
He thought that they had no business being in areas like abortion and, you know, sex. Just one thing after another. He just was appalled that this had become sort of the growing principal concern of the Republican Party.
Noting that he had promised to appoint the most qualified woman I can possibly find to the Supreme Court, Mr. Reagan this morning announced he had found such a woman.
I will send to the Senate the nomination of Judge Sandra Day O'Connor of Arizona Court of Appeals for confirmation as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
The White House has received thousands of letters and telegrams opposing Judge O'Connor's nomination from right-to-life groups.
During my nomination, there was some criticism from one or two people who weren't too happy about it. Barry Goldwater had been a senator for some years. When my name surfaced, he immediately spoke out in support. Like most things with Barry Goldwater, it was a black or white proposition. He was for you or not.
What do you want to talk about, the Air Force or Chile? Oh, Sandra O'Connor.
Pro-choice would have been part of his kind of libertarian thing. It was kind of like, hey, you know what I mean? Man goes out in the West, you got your land, you farm it, you take care of yourself. Government shouldn't tell you what to do.
If it's going to take a fight, they're going to find old Goldie fighting like hell. I'm probably the most conservative member of Congress, and I don't like to get kicked around by people who call themselves conservative on a non-conservative matter. This is not a conservative issue. Abortion is not a conservative issue. It's a question of who's best for the court.
The Reverend Jerry Falwell says that good.
Okay, so I wanted to show you that solely because to show you Barry Goldwater's influence. Just the latter part, the only time that Barry Goldwater and the New Right kind of opposed each other was the Sandra Day O'Connor appointment, but don't worry too much about that. What was more important is the new conservative evolution. All right, so let's continue. Keep on forgetting to present. Gotta present. Okay, so let's talk about the some other things. Okay, so just note some medical breakthroughs during this time. Like you have your polio vaccine in the 50s, you have CT scans, you have MRIs in 1971, stem cell therapy in 1998, and that's where you can use stem cells to like rehabilitate things, regenerate things, okay? We know that AIDS will be first diagnosed in the early 80s. Cancer will start to be a bigger problem. Obesity will start to be a bigger problem. We talked about a lot of these things already, like the EPA and stuff. We'll start to look at other types of resources. Note, Chernobyl is probably one of the worst, if not the worst, nuclear meltdown in the Soviet Union. Okay. And especially like during this time, we start to focus on like today, like global warming and climate change problems. Okay. Also want to point out that, this is 2000 census data. 1/8 of Americans are basically elderly, 65 or older. That's huge. Okay. The life expectancy as of 2012 is 78 years old. So it's getting, people are living longer. Baby boomers are the ones who are retiring. My parents are baby boomers, and they've been retired for a few years. The big problem is Social Security. There are more people retiring and withdrawing money than actually people working and putting in. And so there'll start to be this big issue that's called Save Social Security. Like, you know, the federal government needs to make sure that there's money in there for people like me who's working. So as more and more people make up this graying of America, Social Security might be at risk. Okay. American family, almost 50% divorce rate. Ugh. Okay. And with education, 1 in 4, so 25% of 25 to 34-year-olds will, you know, finish a 4-year college degree. So that's an improvement. Okay, we know that with technology, you have automation. The idea, I heard that like Steak and Shake, they're getting rid of like dining in, and they're just going to have like computers that you order stuff from. It's the idea of, you know, it's like self-checkout at Kroger instead of like hiring someone, using robots. The internet and the World Wide Web is going to be a huge game changer, especially in the 90s. And genetics. We're going to learn a lot about genetics, the structure, the double helix and all that will be discovered in 1953. And then you have the Human Genome Project to understand the genetics even better. Okay, we talked about the Immigration Act of 65. We also talked about the Immigration and Control Act already. Just remember, both of them really lead to more Asian and Latin American immigrants coming to America. Okay. Also, there's a debate about this multiculturalism, this immigration. Some people say, oh, America is a melting pot. We're all assimilating and, you know, whatever. Some people argue, no, we're a salad bowl. It's the idea that you are not assimilating. You're maintaining that autonomy and preserving your culture. Okay. All right. So now we're going to talk about President Ronald Reagan. Okay. He is going to defeat Jimmy Carter in the election of 1980. Remember, the day of the election in 1980 was the 1-year anniversary of the Iranian hostage crisis. And they will do some TV debates. And Ronald Reagan really steals the show. He points out what he called the misery index. That's going to be like unemployment number. In addition, when you sum the unemployment number and the inflation number, he called it a misery index of 28. And then near the end of the debate, how he closes it, he says, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Think about that. The gas, the inflation, the hostages, okay? And that right there just like stole the show for him. He did win 51% of the popular vote and almost 91% of the electoral vote. Okay. What's interesting is that New Deal coalition, Reagan has it now. Okay. Those he took 50% of the blue collar vote. So that a chunk of that New Deal coalition is now part of the Reagan Revolution. Okay. Also, it's not just the White House. In Congress, Republicans will gain 33 seats in the House in that election alone in 1980. Okay. And there will be some Southern Democrats who will start to support Reagan. So things are, yeah, I mean, it's going to be pretty good for Reagan at first. Okay. And here is this question.
Next Tuesday, all of you will go to the polls. Who stand there in the polling place and make a decision. I think when you make that decision, it might be well if you would ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is it easier for you to go and buy things in the stores than it was 4 years ago? Is there more or less unemployment in the country than there was 4 years ago? Is America as respected throughout the world as it was? Do you feel that our security is as safe, that we're as strong as we were 4 years ago? And if you answer all of those questions yes, why then I think your choice is very obvious as to who you'll vote for. If you don't agree, if you don't think that this course that we've been on for the last 4 years is what you would like to see us follow for the next 4, then I could suggest another choice that you have.
Okay, so let's talk about Ronald Reagan. His nickname was the Teflon president, Teflon. Okay, Teflon, I believe, was invented by NASA, and it's what makes nonstick pans nonstick. So it's the idea that some things, people try to stick things on them and they just bounced off. For instance, 2 months into office, there was an assassination attempt on him. Okay. And he was rushed to the hospital, had surgery, got the bullet removed. The next day he's in his pajamas outside the balcony cracking jokes. Like I told the doctors, I hope you I hope you are Republicans, that kind of thing. And it just really like made him, even though he was the oldest president at the time elected, I think Trump was older. But that kind of bounced off of him and made him stronger. Okay. When he is inaugurated, his inaugural address is very famous. The quote is, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem, meaning big government. Okay. So let's talk about Reaganomics. Okay. So Reaganomics, he called it what is called supply side economics. So I'd make sure you write supply side economics somewhere. Okay. He is a conservative. Okay. He believes, just like Andrew Mellon of the 1920s, that if you can cut income taxes, if you cut inheritance taxes and cut business taxes, capital gains taxes, that money would go, and that goes more money in the private sector, which would help with jobs, better pay, that kind of stuff, instead of the government doing whatever it wants with taxes, okay? This critics of supply side economics would call this trickle-down economics, meaning like it only works if people allow it to trickle down, and usually it doesn't. George H.W. Bush ran against him for the 1980 Republican nomination, and he referred to Reaganomics as voodoo economics. Like it just poof, it's like magic, okay? Kind of making fun of it. So what will happen is he wanted a 30% reduction of taxes. Congress, here's the blank, will vote for a 25% decrease. Okay, I believe the largest tax bracket was 28%. So like the richest of the richest paid 28% of their income tax, which, to put in perspective, I think I pay a little bit more than 28% today in 2021. Okay, so again, significantly, reduce income taxes and capital gains and all that kind of stuff. Okay, he also believes in not spending too much money on welfare stuff. Okay, that's what we call social spending. Okay, he wanted Republicans in Congress to cut more than $40 billion in domestic programs. So he wanted to cut, food stamps, student loans, mass transportation. Okay, he did say no cuts to Social Security and to Medicare. Think about it. The old people like him, and he wants to make sure the old people still like him. So we don't want to cut that. So again, he wants $40 billion of social welfare programs cut, but not Medicare and not Social Security. Okay. So again, you have 25% tax cuts, $40 billion of cuts of social spending cuts. Okay. And then triple defense spending. Okay. So what's going to end up happening is that this is going to cause us to go into significant debt, because the tax cuts and the domestic spending kind of cancel each other out, but the defense spending being tripled really leads to, a deficit. Okay. And again, he said government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. He did not like big government. Okay. We will have a fall in exports, so there'll be a trade deficit. Okay. There will be a stock market crash in 1982, and people got a little too greedy. And in 1987, there'll be a really bad stock market crash. if you ever seen The Wolf of Wall Street, and it's like Leonardo DiCaprio's character's first day at work, and everything shuts down and stuff, it represents that day in 1987, okay, in October. And because the debt is so wing-wong, Congress will eventually pass the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Balanced Budget Act to try to curb the deficit, because he didn't really want deficit spending. Okay. So again, Reaganomics, 3 things. 25% income tax cut social spending, but not Medicare and Social Security, and then triple defense spending. Okay, so what's going to happen is unemployment actually decreased from almost 8% down to 5% in 1989. So unemployment did get better. Inflation also decreased. Okay, we did have a trade deficit that quadrupled, so we're not going to be making as much money. Our national debt went from, almost 100 billion to 2.9 trillion in 1989. Okay, but here's the thing: income. The poverty rate only decreased by 1%, basically. Income doubled for the top 1%. Okay, so you can see there. If you were rich, you loved him. If you were below the poverty line, you did not like him because he cut a lot of your stuff. Okay, so I'm going to show you a clip very quickly, and just note that this person is very biased against Reaganomics. So again, that person clearly was, that bias is definitely there for, they were definitely anti-Reaganomics. And, it's one of those things. He didn't want big government, but he did increase the federal employee number, and he also increased the budget. Okay. I'm going to just hit some highlights here. His Secretary of State is Alexander Haig, Haig. And his first term in office, first 4 years, there is no détente. He pushes, and he calls the Soviet Union the evil empire and the focus of evil in the modern world. He is like, we are tough. It's kind of, the purpose was to intimidate the Soviet Union, okay? And it kind of worked. And for example, a reason why they're evil is that there was a Korean airliner, like Delta, but a Korean, and the Soviets shot it down because it got into their airspace and killed almost 300 people. Okay, so let's talk about Nicaragua. Okay, so in Nicaragua and Latin America, there are some communists called the Sandinistas, and they're trying to turn Nicaragua into a communist state. Okay, so think like there's a civil war in Nicaragua. It's going to be the Sandinistas, who are communists, versus the Contras, who are not communists. Now, they kill a lot of people. The Contras are not perfect, but they are not communist, and that's what gets our attention. And the opposition to the Sandinistas are the Contras, Contras. Okay? We want to help the Contras. We want to finance the Contras, the CIA. Okay? But what's going to happen is because of this huge deficit from Reaganomics, Congress will pass what is called the Boland Amendment, which actually says for a couple of years, 2 years, no military or financial help to the Contras. I think it's one of those examples. One, we don't need to be spending all this extra money. And two, we don't want to have a Vietnam War basically in Nicaragua. You know what I'm saying? And so the Boland Amendment says for 2 years, we cannot help the Contras in any way. No troops, no money, whatever. Okay. But here's something. Around the same time, this is completely separate. There are some U.S. Citizens who are taken hostage, okay, by these Arabs in Lebanon, and we cannot get them released. So just remember that. Also want to point out in the Caribbean, in Grenada in 1983, there's a group of pro-Cuban communist people who want to basically do a coup and make Grenada communist. And this is part of that like rollback idea, like, we're not going to let it. We're going to liberate it. Kind of like brinksmanship. It's called rollback with Reagan. He will send in the U.S. Marines. And we're talking like in hours, the communist people back out. And Grenada is not communist. And that makes him look, it was a big gamble, and it made Ronald Reagan look very fierce, very strong. Okay. So let's talk about the Iran-Contra affair. So here's this little thing right here. It might be backwards. Just work with me here. Okay. We know that in Nicaragua, it's the Sandinistas versus the Contras. Okay. But remember, there's the Boland Amendment, which says we cannot help the Contras by any means for 2 years. Okay. We also know that in Lebanon, there are U.S. hostages. Okay. So there's going to be this plan. Okay. And supposedly Oliver North, right there, that's him in court, because you'll see the truth comes out. He is testifying there. That's him. Okay. So here's why it's sketchy. Okay. What's going to happen is we do not get along with Iran. Remember the Iranian hostage crisis, all that kind of stuff? We don't really get along with Iran. Okay. But they need weapons, like guns and stuff. And they're friends with these Lebanese, radicals, okay, who have our hostages. So what we decide to do is we will sell them. We will sell the Iranians weapons. So we're going to make money from the guns and stuff. And what they promise to do is try to convince these Lebanese people to release the hostages. So again, we are selling one of our enemies, Iran, weapons, and they promise to try to influence the release of the hostages. From this money, okay, this is where it gets sketchy. From this money it's going to, because again, that looks bad that we're selling our enemy weapons. So this is all under the table. What happens is this money's got to go somewhere. And someone had the bright idea, since no one knows about this money right here, let's go ahead and just funnel it secretly to the Contras. Why is this wrong? What does it violate? It violates the Boland Amendment, which said we were not allowed to help the Contras. But you see, we found a way. Okay? And Oliver North, like, people will find out about this. Oliver North is the one who kind of falls on the sword. You know what I'm saying? Like, someone's got to go down, and it's him. He said, he was like, yes, there were papers. I did shred some papers. Okay. But do you see how, like, what's going to happen is Ronald Reagan's going to, like, go on national TV, and he's like, look, I don't want to believe it, but I guess this happened. And some people criticize Reagan as, like, being too relaxed of a leader, and the people underneath him did stuff. But the thing is, again, Teflon president, he went on live TV, kind of owned it, said he was sorry, and poof, everything went away. Also during this time, there are some Marines in their barracks in Lebanon, and there are some radical Muslims who crash a truckload full of explosives into this Marine barrack in Lebanon, and almost 240 Marines are killed. And so people are like, why were we even in there? And so Reagan's going to be like, yeah, you're right. Why are we even in there? It's going to withdraw the Marines. Okay. So the Iran-Contra affair, let's go ahead and do this. It's going to be Muslims. Okay. And then secret plan to sell tanks, weapons, whatever, to release the hostages. Oliver North was supposedly in on this plan. Money from the sale would be diverted to the Contras. Okay. Good. Now let's talk about Reagan and Gorbachev meeting. Okay. So remember I told you that first term, we are fierce. Soviets are evil. Okay. During the second term, though, there is a change. There is a new leader. It's not Brezhnev. It's Mikhail Gorbachev. And he has like a birthmark. You can see right there. And he, you know, he's definitely intimidated by Reagan. And he, because in a way we were so intimidating, he decides to start talking with Reagan. Okay. So you see, like, first term Reagan, no détente. But second term, you could say détente for sure. Okay. So a couple things. You have Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms. He talks about glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost is the blank that's there. Glasnost means like openness, like freedom of expression, more like, think Bill of Rights, First Amendment rights for us. Like, he's actually embracing that for the Soviet Union. Okay. He also has another policy called perestroika, which is a policy of trying to encourage some capitalistic free market economies in the Soviet Union. Okay. So you see, he's kind of like consulting with Reagan on things and stuff. Things are better with Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan. Okay. And another example, there will be a treaty that they signed right here. Okay. It's called the Inf Treaty. And it was, it's the INF Treaty. And it basically means like inspection. So it's like, we're going to limit our nuclear missiles and all that kind of stuff, but let's also send inspectors from each side. And the idea is called trust but verify. The idea of, we trust you that you will hold these ratios, but we will send inspectors just to verify on both sides. Okay. And then we know how the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Well, Gorbachev said that was morally wrong, trying to invade Afghanistan, so he had to withdraw the troops. So you see, we're going to work with Gorbachev, okay? Another thing, too, if you go up to the top of the notes, one thing that we really spent, remember that defense budget tripled? Huge reason was something called SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. There's also more battleships and nuclear submarines and all that kind of stuff. But this basically, I kid you not, okay? It's like, here is America. I know that's really bad, but you get it, okay? And what SDI supposedly did is that it created a little invisible shield around America. And if there was a nuclear missile that was headed to America, this invisible laser shield would zap the missile and get rid of it. Think of it as like a fly trap, zaps. Okay. Does this exist? No. And we spend lots of money, but you know what? Reagan announced we had it, and the Soviets believed us, and the Soviets will spend money and run out. The Soviet Union runs out of money because they were the space race. They tried to compete with our SDI that we didn't even have. So who really were the ultimate suckers? The Soviets, because they believed we had it. And then want to point out that there is Reagan in Berlin, and he's in front of the Brandenburg Gate, but also the Berlin Wall. And he says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Okay. Well, in 1989, he's no longer president, but it's the beginning of the tearing down of the Berlin Wall. Coming off strong. Okay. Want to point out, you have the election of 1984. It's Ronald Reagan versus Walter Mondale. What is interesting is that he does run the first female on a major party ticket. Okay, Geraldine Ferraro. Now you can see he basically gets his state. Okay, it's a landslide. I mean, look at that. Okay. And his big tagline was, it's morning again in America. Like just saying how great things are. Okay. Jesse Jackson, he's still alive. He runs under the Rainbow Coalition. Think Rainbow has nothing to do with sexuality and gender and stuff. It's with races, all the different colors. Okay. I told you about the assassination attempt. It's very interesting. It was outside of a Washington hotel. And John Hinckley Jr., he was obsessed with the child actress who was a teenager at this time, Jodie Foster. And he would call her college. There'd be like a payphone. He would call and ask for her, and she would answer, and you could just hear him breathing, really creepy. And she stopped answering him. And he was like, I am meant to be with her. And so he was like, how can I prove my devotion and love to Jodie Foster? And he was like, I'll assassinate the president to prove my love. Well, he ended up being okay, but his press secretary will definitely have some disabilities from it. And it didn't work out. He'll be arrested and all that kind of stuff, mental, insanity plea and all that kind of stuff. But what is interesting, though, is that about 5 years ago, Jodie Foster came out as a lesbian. And it was noted that John Hinckley Jr. was very, very upset. Okay, Reagan did appoint conservatives to the Supreme Court. Senator Day O'Connor, first woman on the Supreme Court. Okay. And just note, he appoints this Chief Justice, William Rehnquist. We'll talk about more of his stuff later. Okay, let's see. So let me show you a couple things and then we'll be finished.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
This is an important message from Pintus and Mullins Law Firm. If you or a loved one were diagnosed with mesothelioma or...
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
And again, it's morning again in America was the big thing for 1984. In 1980, his big slogan was "Make America Great." Okay. A couple of things. There'll be a lot of deregulation when he is president. So like the EPA won't be as strong on that kind of stuff. Labor unions. Okay. He didn't really support labor unions. For instance, you had air traffic controllers were federal workers. Okay. They went on strike. And since they're federal workers, and who's in charge of the federal workers? Executive branch. He just fired them all and said, "Oh, you've lost your certification," and then replaced them. So he didn't try to negotiate it. He just like, "Okay, you're going to go on strike? Fine, you're fired." Okay. So not good for labor unions when Reagan's president. I told you that, the inflation rate was basically down to 4%. That's good. Okay. We talked about social issues. We talked about the election of 1984. I told you how we're going to have a huge federal deficit and trade deficits. We talked about how, he said early on, first term, that Soviet Union was the focus of evil in the modern world. We talked about how we spent a lot of money in Reaganomics on defense, especially developing SDI. We go into debt significantly because of that. But some people say, you know what? It's all good because in the end, the Soviets trying to compete with our SDI is what caused their economic institutions to collapse. We talked about Central America with the Sandinistas and the Contras and how the Boland Amendment said we could not help them, but we found a way, and that's called the Iran-Contra affair. We talked about Grenada in the Caribbean where we look really tough. Just we invade this island, make sure communism doesn't start there. We know that the Iran-Contra affair will come out. Oliver North will kind of take the, We talked about how we had U.S. Marines in Lebanon and some radical Muslims will, run into a suicide mission and kill hundreds of Marines. And as a result, we withdraw the Marines. We know that during Reagan's second term, you have a new guy, Mikhail Gorbachev, and things get improved, especially because Mikhail Gorbachev believes in glasnost and Perestroika, which is really good for America. We have the Inf Treaty. Okay. Yeah. Another nickname is he was the great communicator. He, the fact that he used kind of like the fireside chats that FDR used, one of his idols was FDR, even though they did not really agree with politics, but like using the charisma, the technology to reach out and calm the American people. He did that with the TV. Okay. That is it for chapter 30.